Well, it's been almost 2 years since Silent Hill 2 Remake released and deeply divided the fanbase. However, we're not here to discuss the quality of the game itself, we're here to discuss the quality of its performance, which is somewhat undesirable to say the least. I'll be testing a select few demanding areas where I personally experienced significant performance issues when I first played the game, starting at the absolute highest settings before moving on to a mixture of more optimized ones. Now, it's important to say and explain that the performance issues experienced in this game, for me, mainly were in the starting areas. Once I moved past the apartments, the performance was fairly stable. There was stuttering here and there, but it was relatively playable. It was nothing as bad as Dead Space Remake, for example. I also won't be using Raytracing for the majority of this benchmark. The RT implementation in Silent Hill 2 feels pretty poor for the performance cost, taking a significant chunk out of your frame rate for a very little visual gain. It primarily affects reflections, and considering the game already uses lumen reflections, which actually look pretty decent, enabling RT mostly just makes them a little clearer while absolutely hammering performance. I'm not too sure if it adds anything other than reflections into the game and image, but it definitely tanks the frame rate. I will, however, briefly test frame generation as well, just to show what sort of numbers are possible with it enabled. Essentially, if you're playing on a high refresh rate monitor, our goal here would be to get a stable 60 FPS or something like 60 FPS with headroom, and then enable frame generation on so you can push those higher refresh rates fairly comfortably, which is, very doable in this game. So with that out of the way, let's see just how well Silent Hill 2 runs today and whether there has been any patches or changes or fixes that would have addressed this performance. Okay, so we're back today with Silent Hill 2. Just testing some settings, just testing a couple of things. I'll be running 2K with DLSS on quality, RTX and frame gen off, and all the other settings will pretty much be maxed out, except anti-aliasing because we already have DLSS. And motion blur is off just to make sure you guys get the highest quality and there's no like pixelation or anything. Scene occlusion, I'm going to leave this on just occlusion queries because I've tested this setting for stuttering, frame changes, and I haven't particularly noticed any differences. So this is maybe something you guys would want to experiment with yourselves if you're playing the game, but I digress. I haven't found anything any differences with this particular setting. So yeah, I'm gonna start by kicking things off in the apartments here. This is the kind of like first really demanding CPU GPU bound area here, especially when you first enter and you look towards this area. So we're clocking in at about 100 FPS, pretty good average, 95 to 100. And you notice they'll start dropping kind of as we head into here, through here. And you'll also notice some stuttering, especially around here on this staircase. There'll be like a small, tiny hitch. This kind of has traversal stutter, right? So as you can see here, we've dipped to like the 80s. Now we're back up to 100s. So it seems like this area here, for whatever reason, the staircase is like a loading zone, right? It's like parts of the level or the area kind of load in. But as you go further into the apartments, you notice things stabilize, right? So the frame rates will even out and things will kind of, stabilize and you'll be okay. In general, like the only really bad GPU, CPU bound area, I think it's mostly CPU bound, is here on this staircase. Which is a shame because you'll be going through this staircase a lot when you're playing the game. So you might find stuttering or frame drops, but it drops for whatever reason down to 80s in this area. And it kind of just, yeah, like, I don't know, turning the flashlight on and off, it has no difference, but it seems like, yeah, there's some sort of weird culling or loading going on here in this particular area. And as a result, you get frame drops, right? This area as well, in particular, is quite heavy. Not sure why. Maybe it's the water and everything, but you get like a fat dip when you come out of here to the 70s. And then most of the apartments run fine. There are a few areas in the otherworld when you're in the apartments doing puzzles that can result in frame drops, but it's only a very momentary thing, so it doesn't last for too long. As you can see here, yeah, we're dropping to like 80s, 70s. which is, it's not bad. Not bad at all, but you would kind of expect this kind of hardware to have a higher, more stable frame rate, right? Without so many drops. So this is pretty much it for the apartments, I feel. See, there was a little stutter there. There's not much else to really see or explore here, testing-wise. I find the rest of the apartments do run fairly well because, for the most part, you'll be in corridors such as this one, where there's not much rendering happening, right? Not much stuff going on. And you'll be going kind of from apartment to apartment, like so. And, you know, in these areas, the frame rate is fairly decent. So, yeah. Okay, so the next area that I will be testing is outside Neely's bar. So at the moment you can see I'm getting like 100, 120 in town. Normally when you're in the town is where you get a lot of stuttering. The frame rate itself will be fine, it will be high. But you'll be seeing a lot of stuttering in this area. So particularly if you go down here. I'm just gonna ignore this guy. But in particular, if you go down through here, do whatever you need to do in this area, and then when you start coming back, this is where you're going to start seeing kind of significant dips, it feels like. Look, there was a stutter right there, and here come the stutters, like traversal stutters. It's like the area is loading backwards. See? There's a lot of stutters happening now. And it kind of stabilizes. And as you go between Neely's and all these other places, as you turn the streets and corners, you'll start noticing that there will be a lot of traversal stutter. See? Like so. Now this is nowhere near as bad or as egregious as Dead Space Remake, but it is still something that is present. And this is mostly present throughout the game. Like almost throughout the entire game. Later areas are more kind of corridor based, right? You spend more time in corridors and tight spaces and areas. But this traversal stuttering is not as bad, but the dips are still there. Now I think this has improved significantly since release. It used to be way worse. There used to be way more stuttering. Right? And the frames in the town were generally, in my opinion, way worse. But we're pretty much in town and we're constantly above 100 FPS, which is really nice, so, you know. And you got the lumen reflections here, right? And these are pretty good, considering like the frame rate we're getting. But yeah, you'll notice as you're moving around, just a bit of stutter here and there. And it's not even as bad as it used to be, but it is there. Like I said, so you got to keep an eye on it. If it bothers you, then yeah, it is one of these things. But performance-wise, this is quite respectable. This is constantly above 100 FPS in the town section, maybe dropping below 110 every now and then. When things are loading in, assets are streaming. So this is more than playable. I was seeing lower frames in the apartments, so props to them for whatever optimizations they've done to town. Definitely an improvement. Well, another thing I wanted to test out was the run into town. So I had to start a new game for this. The first initial run, or this area in particular, it does see some frame hits as well. So the starting area is a bit, yeah, it's a bit meaty performance-wise. But it gets especially bad, or it was especially bad, when you ran into town. So as you descend down these steps, and you kind of start heading into town and start heading through the forest, is where you start seeing some dips. I would expect something like 80s or 70s frame rate wise, but it's holding out fairly well. Yeah, we're almost at 100, so the frame dips that were present on release are not really as prevalent here. There used to be a lot of stuttering here and frame drops, and you know, your frames would constantly be kind of tanking, but this is fairly respectable. Still not the best, but Like, in my opinion, it should be better, but the game does look really gorgeous. With the latest DLSS preset and preset K, the game does look very, very nice and clean. And then here we are, we're at the cemetery. And you had a little stutter there. And then the frame rate's capped to 30, whatever, right? And if we continue pushing onwards, I think it was this way. Remember. So we can see like a dip to 90. Probably because of the fog and the water and everything. The shadows. Because the fog has its own shadow, if I'm not mistaken. If we continue running down this path, see there was a big hitch there. So the game was just probably loading the area ahead. As you can see, the frame time is fairly stable, aside from those like traversal stutters. They're definitely not fixed, right? It's not perfect, but it isn't as bad or as egregious as it was at the start of the game's release. The chainsaw. They at the very least did some work towards this, towards making this perform better. Yeah, like constant 80s, 90s. So the average that we're getting for the readings here is 95, which is pretty good. Yeah, like I don't think it's gonna drastically start dipping even when we hit town, as you saw previously in the previous scenes. So yeah, it's yeah, it's pretty good. And also, so here's where you can see the reflections in particular getting a bit fuzzy, right? So let me show you what happens when you enable ray tracing. So I'm going to go into the settings. I'm going to enable the ray tracing option, right? As you can see here, even from this comparison, it's not that great, honestly. So I've enabled ray tracing, lost about 5-10 FPS in this particular scene, but the reflections are not much better. They're still a bit cooked in this particular location, but my frame rate is now dipped to around 80. So my frame rate has definitely taken a hit here. Right, but the reflections are not that much better. There's not much of a visual gain or much of anything to be had when having ray tracing on. If I disable this, I'm comfortably back up at 100 FPS. So we know it's like a 20 FPS cut. In this case, probably 20%, right? FPS cut for almost no visual gain. I'm not sure what they did with the implementation here, but it is what it is. So yeah, that's that. Okay, so this time I will be testing the Woodside Apartments again. But this time I'll be making one small change to the settings, or two small changes in this case. I'll be setting DLSS to balanced, and I'll also be changing shadow quality from high to medium. This change in itself should net you about 10 to 15 frames per second, depending on your system. But this should actually help with some of the frame drops seen in some of the areas we've been to. Everything else can pretty much stay on high. The difference between shaders, medium, and high, and effects and everything like this is not significant. Maybe the only other setting I could imagine if you really wanted to change will be SSR, screen space reflections, to create, you know, the better reflections. But I digress. I don't really think this would improve performance all that much. But if you're really desperate for some frames, then that would be your kind of go-to thing. But if we do DLSS balance now, right, with medium shadows, let's see what sort of averages we're going to be getting now. So we're getting like 105 standing in the office. I'm going to walk over here and look at the staircase again. I'm going to walk into the staircase section and see what sort of frames we'll be getting. Yeah, so we were getting like 80 in this area before, right? There was like a significant dip when entering through here, like 80, 88. So we're netting about 10 to 20 more FPS. There was a little traversal stutter hitch that was there before. And definitely having your light on here doesn't help either, because it creates all these dynamic shadows. But lowering these to medium kind of already improves the frame rate quite a bit. As you can see in the rest of the apartments here, frame rate is nice and high. So the only real downside is, well, there isn't really a downside to visuals. The DLSS balanced with the latest presets still looks quite decent. Look, we had the lowest dip we had there was about 88 when we're stepping off the staircase through here. And I think it's a combination of all the shadows, the flashlight. So if I turn this flashlight off, see? We're like up to 110. So all these dynamic shadows. Admittedly, it looks really nice. It does, or it can tank the frame rate just a bit. Feel. Yeah. And then if we go out into the courtyard, let's see what sort of difference we had. Before I stepped through this door, I was having about 70 FPS, right? Or when I stepped through this. So we're now up like 15 frames in this area. For what I can only describe as very minimal visual impact. I can't really see much of everything, except there's maybe a bit of like denoising issues here with lumen going on the floor. And the reflections, but this is not something people will be noticing anyway. This sort of shit plagues consoles as well, so PC's not exclusive to this sort of stuff. Yeah, I mean, getting almost 100 in this area itself is fairly good. There we go. Well, we had a dip here to like 80, 82. Felt like almost like a traversal stutter, because the frame time kind of spiked. It was very flat, and then it kind of jumped as I stepped through here. Now, I imagine it's because it had to load this area here. That's behind this door. Right? So it's like loading the levels in chunks, hence you get the traversal stutter. So yeah, nice, solid improvement. So if you're struggling with performance in this game, I definitely recommend lowering shadows and seeing if that makes any difference or has any impact at all. Okay, so we're back at Neely's, and this is without frame gen. We're averaging, well, we're hitting like 140, 130 something frames per second. So this is quite a substantial difference. Out on the street, we're still like 120, 130. So let's head over down this street and then come back and do a little run again. See how much that affects the frame rate. It definitely feels like the problematic areas have been kind of addressed. Like the town and the run into town were very problematic. Yeah, see, there's a traversal stutter, so they see it dipped for like a couple milliseconds and then it went back up. See, anytime that frame time spikes, something is being streamed or loaded. It's still not too bad. And one thing I noticed on medium, I don't know if you'll be able to see this on the video, when James is running and there's a fog, like if you look at his shoulder, there's like a weird shadowing occasionally popping into view, like he's casting a shadow on the fog or something like that, like he has an aura, like a dark aura. So I think that is like a small visual bug that you get from running these kind of medium shadows. Thing is, this is now like what I would consider a really good frame rate. I mean, anything above 120 at 1440p is, in my opinion, good. Very, very good. I could almost call this good optimization, except for the fact that I am like getting the traversal stutters. This will happen to everybody, right? So it can't be argued. You can't really mitigate it in any way, shape, or form. If I run out into the street, yeah, like it's really good. So anyone on a lower spec machine shouldn't have many problems hitting 60 FPS in these areas. You will definitely see dips in the apartments, which in my opinion is probably the worst optimized area in the game. But anything else should be fairly fine. Okay, so here we are again, now with the optimized, or as I like to call them, balanced settings. we're getting, yeah, way over 100 FPS now in the starting area. This was dipping, if you remember, into the 80s, 90s or whatever. And yeah, this is pretty good. Like, I would consider this to be fairly decent because the game does look very nice. It's not as fuzzy as it was on release. On release, you have to consider the fact that DLSS was also a few versions behind. So a lot of the leaves you're seeing here, whatever, I was leaving some significant trailing behind, and it was affecting visual quality significantly. But as DLSS upgraded and, you know, updated over the 2 years that this game has been out, a lot of these issues have been resolved. The only thing I can really kind of notice is a bit of shimmering around James's hair, but other than that, it is decent. And once again, the frame rate here when we're running through the forest is pretty stellar. There is no frame dips, no traversal stutter that I can see. We're constantly at 110. And this is without any sort of frame generation. So of course, if you want frame generation to hit those super high refresh rates, you absolutely can use it. Even if you really needed to hit 60, I probably wouldn't recommend it, but if you're very desperate for some frames and you know, you want that extra smoothness and you don't mind the input lag and the artifacting that may come with it, then I definitely would say, yeah, go for it. But oh, let me skip it. If we're running this, yeah, without frame gen, without any of the like bells and whistles, just DLSS quality or balanced, you'll definitely have like a good experience. You can probably switch DLSS up to quality as well, and you'll probably lose about 10 frames on average, 10 to 15 frames. It does vary by game. Your mileage will most certainly vary, but I would say this definitely runs better than Delta, than MGS Delta, which I tested earlier in the week. So the performance here is definitely pretty good. I mean, I'd overall say it's okay, it's decent, except for a select few areas. It's only at the start of the game where you'll be impacted the most, I feel. Everywhere else after the start of the game feels fairly well optimized in terms of performance, like Brookhaven, Historical Society, Prison, everything like that. I never personally experienced any issues, even on my old bottleneck system. So yeah, it's pretty good. So as a fun little test, what I'm going to do is I'm also going to turn the shadows back up to high and DLSS quality. And I'm also going to whack on frame generation to see what sort of frames we're going to be getting with this on the higher settings. So, not sure if my frame time graph might not show this correctly or properly. But you can see the Steam overlay at the very top left. With DLSS frame gen, we're getting 150 frames. But on the right-hand side, right next to it, you'll see an FPS counter that says 74, 75. Those are the actual real frames that I'm getting with FrameGen on. Because FrameGen itself incurs a cost of about 5 to 10%, depending on the area and your frame rate. So before FrameGen, I was getting about 90 frames here. 100 to a 90 frames here. So obviously, taking that into account, that's a bit of a cut. And it's now using those 75 frames to generate the 150. That you see there, right? To provide me that extra smoothness. And yeah, I noticed here, there was a bit of a hitch and stutter, which wasn't there before. So let's see, like average frames are pretty high, pretty good. I mean, yeah, of course, it's smooth. It's good for high refresh rate gaming. I definitely feel like there's a bit more stutter with FrameGen on. If we come out to the courtyard here. So we've dropped to 58 real frames. So you can feel like a severe dip there. And now even with this like dip in frames, I can actually perceive this. Even though my frame rate is like 118, 114, I can still perceive this dip. Because it manifests as like kind of like slowdown or artifacting, right? So that's why you usually want to keep your frame rate above 60 with frame gen. Of course, it really varies by game, but yeah. So we're like 60 frames, 120. This is probably like the heaviest area. This area. Like when I'm saying averaging like 60, I'm talking about the real frames, not the generated ones. Of course, this looks nice and smooth, but yeah, it does feel like frame gen maybe adds just a little bit of additional stutter here and there. That wasn't there prior. So you can sort of use it to just, yeah, boost yourself up to the higher refresh rates, but if you've got a decent rig and a decent processor, you don't really need it. If I turn this off now, like I said, you'll be getting a 90 FPS, 90 to 100 in this particular instance or area. So it really does depend on your preference, but I do feel in some games frame generation can be a bit more stuttery, or it can lead to a bit more stutters. So that is that. I mean, so overall, I would say the game definitely runs much better than it used to. At least on release, it ran pretty badly. I had trouble even hitting like 60 FPS. Like in certain areas. But like, you know, areas like this, like Brookhaven, they run really well. Areas later into the game, they don't really see or have many frame drops. You know, because it's all like enclosed corridors like this. So you're basically kind of working with a lot of headroom there. A lot of decent performance. You still see the odd traversal stutter here and there. So this is still far from a perfect and very performant port. It's okay, but it is flawed in conclusion, I would say. It is definitely not perfect. And it could use a little bit more work. It's definitely not broken, and it's definitely, in my opinion, not as heavy or as bad as MGS Delta. MGS Delta, in my opinion, runs way worse than this, whilst not looking all that much better, in my opinion. So yeah, I think this pretty much sums it up. Sorry, I was just looking at the frame rate graphs and just seeing what I can read here, but yeah, I think this more or less sums up the video. I would say the game definitely isn't fixed with traversal stuttering, but it also definitely isn't as bad as people sometimes make it out to be, and it's definitely not as good as it still could be. It's probably slightly above average in that regard. So yeah, thank you for sticking around and watching. Peace out, guys.